I think we're going to get started. It's 1:32, and we do want to move forward. Peter Kuznick just told me that today's episode, which we will be seeing, which has never been shown in public like this, in a sort of Q&A forum, and I'm really excited about that, clocks in at 58 minutes and 30 seconds. So we can move forward. So welcome, everyone, to this very special event sponsored by the UCI Humanities Collective and School of Humanities. I am Catherine Liu, the director of the collective, and we are thrilled to be welcoming Peter Kuznick and Oliver Stone to UCIrvine, where they're going to be talking to us about the making of and the ideas behind the Untold History of the United States, a 10-part documentary made for Showtime that premiered last year. And in fact, this episode that we're about to see was shown in January, and a great deal of it is about surveillance, I'm excited to tell you, and then the Snowden events sort of exploded on the scene, so it's going to be incredibly prescient with regard to recent history, which is really the events of the past year. Kuznick and Stone remind us that history is vital to making the future. Research into areas of history that are suppressed or forgotten is a challenge to both scholars and global citizens. Stone and Kuznick were able to reach millions of viewers with this project, but they are screening different episodes of the documentary on campuses throughout the US in order to spur debate and raise awareness of painful and controversial events in US history whose very erasure gives shape to our shared present. Many people deserve thanks for this amazing event, not least of whom are the incredible staff of the School of Humanities. I'm just going to name the Film and Media Studies staff, Eva Jonas, Beth Pace, and the school and for me, the Humanities Collective staff, Linda Lee and Anita Centeno, were outstanding. Our volunteers, our staff volunteers and student volunteers deserve a big thank you, and Professor Georgia Warnke of UC Riverside, who set up this Southern California tour with Kuznick and Stone, all deserve our thank yous. And I want to make a special pitch today to those of you who are in a position to give to UCIrvine. Please consider giving to the Humanities Collective and to the School of Humanities. Help us build bridges to our communities by organizing events such as this. Help us breach the walls of the ivory tower by supporting public humanities. If you want to know anything about what we do, please come to me after the event. I have brochures up here, and Professor Kuznick and Stone will be signing books and DVDs, and I'll be talking to people. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce the Dean of Humanities, Professor Georges Vendin-Abil, who will be introducing the filmmakers and the documentary. Our new dean comes to us from Northeastern University in Boston, where he was founding dean, but he made his career in the UC, so he's returning to UC, first at Davis and then as dean at UC Santa Cruz, a famous scholar of travel literature in the 19th century. He's also very interested in visual culture, history, and mapping, and recently taught a graduate seminar on this topic at UCIrvine. I'm going to ask you all to turn off your cell phones and to refrain from taking photographs for the rest of the event. This event will be web streamed live, and it will be archived at our website so that you can access it later. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dean Georges Vendin-Abil.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here on a Saturday afternoon. And I hope you will find this a very interesting event. We are very honored to be presenting this new, as yet unseen screening of the Showtime series on the Untold History of the United States with director and writer Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick here in the audience to discuss their project with the UCIrvine community. As many of you know, Stone and Kuznick started working on this project in 2008. It is one of the most ambitious documentaries in the history of film. It is narrated by Oliver Stone and seeks to highlight underreported, forgotten, or suppressed aspects of American history. Meticulously researched, beautifully made, this documentary series provides critical touchstones to guide public debate about historical events that Stone and Kuznick feel must be understood if the U.S. is to be able to forge an authentically democratic polity they'll be a source for good on a global and local scale. And I'm reminded of their project that over 50 years ago, actually, in 1962, the great Italian neo-realist filmmaker Roberto Rossellini declared summarily that cinema was dead after he had made many great masterpieces that some of you probably know, such as Rome, Open City, and Paisan, Germany Year Zero, which document the Second World War, and decided that the future was actually in the television series, and made a series which was very largely unknown and beautifully crafted documentary films about history, and felt that this was an important task of the filmmaker today, the kind of educational dimension of cinema in the video and television world. And so I view this particular series as part of that development, and I welcome and appreciate the move. Peter Kuznick is Associate Professor in the Department of History at American University in Washington, D.C. He is the author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America, and co-editor of Rethinking Cold War Culture. Peter Kuznick is also Director of American University's Nuclear Studies Institute. He spearheaded the Committee for a National Discussion of Nuclear History and Current Policy in response to the Smithsonian's Enola Gay exhibit, and co-funded the Nuclear Education Project. He writes often and lectures frequently about how nuclear issues in general and atomic bombings in particular. And I'm reminded of the fact it's no longer part of the news, but the Cold War ended quite a few years ago, and we still have massive arsenals of nuclear weapons on hair trigger that seems to be forgotten, except occasionally recent events where officers at one nuclear installation had to be relieved of command for not surveying or taking care of the nuclear triggers. So I think this is another suppressed issue which maybe might come up under discussion. Oliver Stone is, of course, the Academy Award-winning producer, writer, and director. He's one of the most important voices in cinema today. Began inauspiciously as a dropout from Yale, and he became a veteran in the Vietnam War. Since that time, he has been an assiduous student of American foreign policy and recent history, offering alternative views of the recent past in such classics as Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, JFK, and The Doors. Stone's work in film has defined the ways we've been able to visualize and rethink the costs of the Vietnam War, the attraction of rock and roll, the devastation of the JFK assassination, and other recent or contemporary events. He is animated by what I think is a relentlessly critical conscience regarding the political use and abuse of power that is rarely seen, and as such is an exemplum, along with Kuznick's work, of what it might mean to be a public intellectual in America today. In this sense, their untold history deserves our undivided attention. Oliver Stone will be arriving during the screening and will be here to take questions along with Peter Kuznick for the Q&A following the screening. But for now, please join me in giving a warm UCI welcome to Peter Kuznick, who will be making a few remarks about the episode you're about to see today.
Thank Catherine and Yvonne and Nabil for their warm introductions and for making this possible today. Thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful afternoon when there's so many other things you could be doing. Oliver and I started this project. Well, we started over dinner in Washington. Oliver was scouting locations for his film Pinkville about the My Lai massacre and asked me to have dinner with him in late 2007. And we were talking about history and politics, and Oliver said, "Peter, let's do it finally. We've been friends since 1996. So let's do a documentary together." I figured on a sabbatical, a 60 or 90-minute documentary, I could finish that year and go on with my life. I saw him in New York 2 weeks later, and now it was a 10-hour documentary film series. We ended up doing 12 parts. The other 2 are on the Blu-ray. disc set that weren't shown on Showtime, and it took us 5 years. During that time, I co-authored 2 more books. He made 3 other films, but every waking moment we had, we devoted to this. This is a big project, a lot of research. Halfway through making the documentary, we decided we had to add a book. And so that was initially going to be they wanted a 275-page book. We gave them actually 950 pages. We later cut out 150 to get it down to 800 so people could lift it. So because as much as we were able to get into the documentary, you'll see it probably moves faster and is more dense than any documentary you've ever seen. My friends who are historians say they've got to stop it constantly or they've got to watch it 2 or 3 times to get what's in these episodes. I wrote it. I initially had probably 3 times as much information in every episode as we finally have. I thought Oliver was going to narrate like a New Yorker on speed. Right? But then we tried to put it together, the narration with the visuals, with the music. People were just overwhelmed. So we slowed it down to a point where we think that audiences can get this. So that we're showing episode 10. I think I initially wrote 3 episodes on what we have in this one, because there's so much to say about the Bush administration and the Obama administration. It aired January 12th this year. We delivered it 2 or 3 days before that. We worked right up to the last minute trying to get this one done, our last one. So it's got a lot of our ideas about what's going wrong within your recent memory. Some of the early events that we talk about in earlier episodes are before a lot of people were born. But this was something that we've all lived through, and most of us were pretty conscious during this time. And we haven't aired this one before publicly, although one of my friends, who's a very well-known historian, when it aired on Showtime, wrote me that this is the most radical thing that's ever been shown in the history of television. We hope you agree. We hope you think of that positively. And we're interested. We're eager to get your feedback and your questions. So thanks for coming.
Hello, I'm Oliver Stone. When I was a young boy growing up in New York City, I thought I received a good education. I studied history extensively, especially American history. It made sense. We were the center of the world. There was a manifest destiny. We were the good guys. Well, I've traveled the world now. I continued my education as an infantryman in Vietnam. I've made a lot of movies, some of them about history. And I've learned a lot more than I once knew. And when I heard from my children what they were learning at school, I was perturbed to hear that they were not really getting a more honest view of the world than I did. We live much of our lives in a fog, all of us. But I would like my children to have access to something that looks beyond what I would call the tyranny of now. You watch the media, everyone talks about that thing, the news of the day, and all the subconscious, really important stuff that's going on is being neglected. Napoleon once said that history is a pack of lies agreed upon. Well, I'm not sure I agree. I believe history does have a meaning, does have a purpose, and there is a pattern to be found. And I wanted, with my colleagues, rather than make another feature film, to tell the American story in a way that has never been told before. There are many questions that you may not find answered here, but you will find questions raised that I hope will help make you more conscious. We are going to propose, among other things, a forgotten set of heroes. People who suffered for their beliefs and who have been lost to history because they did not conform. And we are going to debunk some of those heroes that you believe in, not with malice, but by restating the facts. Unless we remind ourselves of the good that we have lost, it's not easy to imagine a better future. By showing you the patterns of behavior which have come to be that you perhaps have not noticed before, we will try to bring you back to the meaning of this country and what so radically changed after World War II. There have been some profound mistakes, but we still have a chance, I strongly believe, to correct them.
As the lights come on, I want to just thank Professor Kuznick and Oliver Stone for this incredibly moving series. I was hoping to have John Wiener, Professor John Wiener, here to make the remarks after the screening, but he is in New York City. So I'm going to make very, very brief remarks about what we've just seen. I thought it was incredibly beautiful and positive at the end. I had just one deep reservation about how difficult it is to actually visualize surveillance. And the very dramatic cut to the scenes from Homeland as an illustration of the total surveillance society is, to me, this dangerous step towards that we're all taking, that we're all on the brink of taking, which is to accept a total surveillance state because we simply can't visualize what it is to be free from that total surveillance state. And in a way, the sort of rights to privacy of the individual body no longer obtain in a moment when surveillance is aggregate, surveillance is at such a massive level, surveillance has such redounding consequences for institutions of higher education like ours. We are all being pushed to put courses online. And this looks great because it's supposed to create more access for students. It's supposed to cheapen make the UC education cheaper. Who is going to own those keystrokes? At the time of the airing of this episode, Edward Snowden had not made his revelations. And Edward Snowden's files keep revealing more and more dark secrets about the ubiquity and the power of the total surveillance state. So imagine a course on surveillance, which I give every 2 years, being online where every single keystroke that you make is potentially recorded. Now, let's not worry about the single keystroke. Let's worry about the 1.75 billion keystrokes and the power of computing to surveil those keystrokes. I remember when rights to privacy and the echoes of fears about the surveillance state started coming up in 2000s, especially in the European community. The Germans are very, very phobic about surveillance, as you might know, as you might understand, because of their history. A lot of Americans responded with this attitude, I'm not doing anything wrong. This doesn't affect me. So I'm just going to leave it at that and invite Oliver Stone and Professor Kuznick to come up and take your questions. I'm going to moderate, and please speak into the microphones. I have volunteers who are going to come up and down the aisles. We'd really like to record the Q&A session, so I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and then I'll pick you out, and Eva and Linda Lee will go up the aisles and take your questions. Here, Peter and Oliver, would you like to come up?
Get some water up here.
Yes, water.
Thank you.
I'm a part-time teacher here at UCIrvine Extension, and I guess I'd like to direct this primarily to Mr. Stone, because like you, I'm also a veteran of the United States military, but unlike you, even though it was during the same era, I was not sent to Vietnam like you were. I was stationed in Germany, so I have great respect for your military service to this country. However, I seem to feel that maybe your experience has turned you against your country in many ways, and I just would wonder if you have ever considered that were it not for the United States of America, and specifically its military, that I don't think there would be a country in the world living in freedom today. And I'll let you answer that, but I'd just like to say to the young audience here that in spite of what you've seen in this one-sided presentation, and in spite of our mistakes and the dark chapters in our history, which we acknowledge, which are, we're making mistakes today, this is still a great country, and I still think that it deserves your support and your loyalty. Thank you.
Well, sir, obviously, we disagree. This 12 hours, 5 years of work is I think, for me, a visual poem to a country that I loved when I was a young man. It was a country that I thought had tremendous idealism, and I had belief in it. I was raised conservative in New York City. My father was a stockbroker. He was on the staff of Eisenhower in World War II. And I thought we were fighting a monolithic communist conspiracy. Moscow, Beijing, Yugoslavia, all of them were against us. And they were not only abroad, but they were in our schools, in our government. McCarthy and everyone in the early 50s was, into the mid-50s, was very much concerned about the communist influence in our government. And anybody on the left wing was in my experience, was vilified. And even in private conversations, it was dangerous to talk in the workplace about things in a non-conformist way. That's why there was such a strange movement for a while in the 50s of beatniks and hippies and people who were poets who were doing things differently. And that was centered in New York and Berkeley and various places, but it was a very rigid country. I went to Vietnam in the belief that I was doing the right thing, and it was a hideous war. It was a hideous war, and the more I found out about it afterward, after what I experienced, because I was a soldier with a worm's eye view of a jungle, but what I found out afterward about the war and the casualties and the bombings of Laos and Cambodia and so forth, and the cold-bloodedness of our attack on civilian population continued. As I found out later, what we had started in Japan and Germany, but in Japan specifically by dropping the atomic bomb, which we can get back to on if anyone wants to go back there. But the atomic bomb was a criminal action, and we don't know that, and we never were educated. We never were educated why the bomb was dropped. We all accept that it had to be dropped, but this is a mythology, and we go into this in chapter 3. This thread runs to today, and this last chapter, which is a dark one, a dark one, brings us through our research. What we ended up with was this, is that we have reached a Star Wars place, where we have full spectrum dominance. Air, land, sea, cyber warfare, we are way ahead of everybody else, and in space we're way ahead of everybody else. But what's worse is that we act, as this gentleman has suggested, as if it were not us, it would be somebody else who would be threatening us. Well, it doesn't always work that way. That's the law of the jungle that I was talking about. And we have always built up the threats. We have magnified them, over-magnified them, to the place where we've become this steroided military machine with 10 times the military budget of China, Russia. We've encircled Russia with NATO bases. We've encircled China. We have alliances all up and down on the pivot to Asia. From Australia up to Korea and Japan have been armed fortresses since 1945. In a sense, we never gave up Japan. We took Japan, and we kept it for ourselves. And it became our hub in the Far East. When Eisenhower was most concerned about the war in Vietnam, he always pointed to Japan as the ultimate domino that would fall. We know the domino theory is bullshit. Vietnam fell. And Cambodia, Thailand, none of them followed in that wake of that failure. It was all before that. Australia, Philippines, Taiwan, they all did well. South Korea specifically well. We have always magnified this threat, and that's what concerns me today. We have terrified our citizens with this need for security, so that when the war on terror happened in 2001, we overreacted completely. Instead of dealing with Osama as a threat, as a vile attack on our institutions, and hunting him down with police, with intelligence work, with the special forces, which we've done, essentially, we put out a terror net around the world with surveillance thrown in that's gotten bigger and bigger, and said to everybody, you're either with us or against us. And we put out this huge surveillance on the whole haystack. We're looking for a needle. It's a crazy way about doing business, and it was exactly the way we did business in Vietnam. A few shots, we'd all freak out, drop a few bombs. On another level, you get a little more incoming, You bombed the shit out of the whole place. Out of Laos, Cambodia, bombs, bombs, bombs. More bombing in Vietnam than in all of World War II, and we had Curtis LeMay in World War II. So I think we react as a mad dog, and we are sick. We have this military aggression inside us. It's evident in our football games where you have flyover jets and always is homage to the military. Now we need a military. I'm all for a military. I joined the military and I see the strengths of it. But we need a military to defend this country and defend its national interests, not to go abroad looking for fights to pick and for countries to intervene in if they don't agree with our way of doing things. We cannot impose one cultural value on the entire world. We cannot, and nor can we impose $1 on the entire world, and we won't be able to sustain that, and that's going to be the cause, I hope, of the downfall of this empire, because we can't afford it. And we're running our people into unemployment, we're running our people into a huge wealth gap between rich and poor. We have no middle class really to speak of anymore. We have lost our goal, and that is what this whole series is about. It's a loss of love. And I wish to God we can turn it around. And that's why we did this thing. And that's why we're here today among you, trying to remind you that we were and can still be a great country, and there are many great heroes in this series that we point to.
I want to pick up on that first.
Please.
You raised the question of Vietnam. It's a really concrete example of what's going wrong in the United States now. President Obama announced a 13-year commemoration of Vietnam so that the American people could understand the noble motives, the good things we were trying to do in Vietnam. A recent survey of American public showed that 51% of 18 to 29-year-olds now think that the Vietnam War was worth fighting. 51% of 18 to 29-year-olds. The old people over 65, 70% think it was a terrible thing. But the younger generation who we're trying to go and trying to reach is not getting that. They're not getting history. They're not understanding history. I ask my students very often, how many Americans died in the war? And somebody will know the number 58,000. I ask them, how many Vietnamese died in the war? And ask yourself, give an answer in your head, how many Vietnamese died in the war? And my students, sometimes, I asked them the other day, the lower estimate I got was 300,000. The highest estimate was 1.3 million. Robert McNamara came into my class at American University, and he said, and he was the architect of the war, Secretary of Defense, he says 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. Americans don't know that. They don't have any idea. I asked my students how many Jews died in the Holocaust. Every hand goes up. They all know 6 million. But none of them know 3.8 million that their own country committed. We look at that Vietnam Memorial. It's very powerful. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. It's 146 feet long. It's got the names of 58,272 Americans who died. The message of the Vietnam Memorial is that the tragedy of Vietnam is that 58,272 Americans died. If that memorial, Oliver and I were recently in Japan. We went to Okinawa. We saw the war memorial in Okinawa. It has the names of all the Americans who died, all the Japanese who died, all the Okinawans who died, the Brits who died, the Aussies who died, everybody. That sends a message. If that Vietnam Memorial actually had the names of the 58,000 Americans, the 3.8 million Vietnamese, the hundreds of thousands of Cambodians, Laotians, and other people who died, it would be over 4 miles long. Now that would be a war memorial, and that would tell something about Vietnam, because as we said in a piece we had yesterday in USA Today, that would be the tombstone to this idea of American exceptionalism that we need. And that's what we're trying to convey here. This idea that it's so dangerous to think that the United States is God's gift to humanity, that we're different than other countries, that we're altruistic, that we spread freedom, and that's what our goal is. When the reality is we're showing throughout this 12-part series and the book that we have with it is that the history has been, that's been a part of the history, but a small part. There's a whole other side of the history that we think Americans have got to understand, not sing our praises, look what we've done wrong so we can get it right next time.
I just wanted to comment and say that it may sound like this is anti-American empire. And both my grandmothers were illiterate, and I'm a college professor, and this couldn't have happened in China. So I'm incredibly grateful to this country, but I'm not grateful to the American empire. I think we have to separate the democratic values, the anti-imperial values that are embedded within the American nation state from its imperial project. The great hope of the American middle class brought so many of your families here to this country. We're a nation of immigrants, but we're also an imperial actor. And I don't think we can be in denial of it. So I love this country as a country, among others. I think that's what's important. And the conservatives can't take away that love. So I really am glad that you brought it back to love. And I hated it, and I hate it when you can only be a conservative and a patriot who loves America and everybody else hates America. No, we love it as a country among others. I think that has to be made clear.
I'd like to thank both of you for being here. Before I ask my question, I want to extend just a brief comment to Mr. Kuznick's acknowledgement of the sacrifices of other people in wartime, peacetime. John F. Kennedy, in his June 10th commencement address at American University, acknowledged the Russian people and the 20 million people they lost fighting fascism in World War II. And maybe it would not hurt us to extend an olive branch, not necessarily to Vladimir Putin as an individual, but as a leader of a country we should engage with and not start a second Cold War. My question is, and Mr. Stone, I met you at the Pittsburgh conference last weekend. In this series, as it ended, you didn't mention in passing the BRIC countries and the SCO. Do you have some optimism, not in a sense of brinkmanship, but that possibly these organizations will counter the American dominance that you've projected in the series?
Did you say the BRIC countries?
BRIC and SCO?
Sorry, am I hearing?
Do you think that there's another hope for BRIC, like Brazil, Russia,
Oh,
India,
BRIC. Yes. Yes, I think this is the most sane world. Multipolar, multicultural. Bring on Brazil, bring on Iran, bring on Russia and China. These are valuable, much older than us cultures, and they have much to contribute to the world. We can get on. Roosevelt proved it. Kennedy was reaching to prove it. There have been many peacekeepers in the world, and they've been sane people, and great soldiers and patriots too. Peter reminded me last night, George McGovern, who was defeated so badly in 1972 by Nixon. Nixon was a big patriot. McGovern was the wimp because he wanted to make terms in Vietnam and so forth. And so McGovern was a guy who flew the most dangerous missions in World War II as a pilot. Nixon was a backdoor, a rear echelon mother in the South Pacific making money off poker. A huge difference, but we always hear that talk from the guys who don't go to war, like Dick Cheney and George Bush. George W. Bush. But your question is BRIC. Yes, by all means, we need balance of power. And in Venezuela, I would include, because there's tremendous resources in the world. We don't want to just hear from Israel and Saudi Arabia. We want to be allied with the world. But we have to get off our kick, which is, we have Merkel of Germany, we have Hollande of France, we have even England criticizing us because we're listening on their cell phones. We picked up 70 million Frenchmen for what, 5-month period or something? I guess that was, but we know in our heart that we're everywhere, listening in. We complain about China's cyber warfare, but we're far superior to China on cyber warfare. We have them targeted from space. They're aware of it. We could blow up China. We have, if anything, now, the 1960 version of the United States, which is a very interesting period because Eisenhower turned this country into a bastion where we had a nuclear first strike policy that we could have wiped out. If we had to go to war, we would go to nukes. And he gave commanders and sub-commanders the right to do that because there were no locks on the weapons back then. So that's where you get the Dr. Strangelove scenario. And I repeat, this is very dangerous because when Kennedy, who was a young president, comes into the system after 13 years of the national security state, he ran headlong into these generals who were eager to go to war. Their attitude was, if we don't get Russia now, they'll get us. They'll come back. They're going to grow stronger and stronger. They're going to build up to parity if we don't get them now. So all the chief of staffs were ready to go. They were ready to go to war, and they knew they would win it. And they could take sustainable casualties. We're back there now because on the border of Russia, We've surrounded Russia with NATO illegally because we were not supposed to do that when Gorbachev made the deal with Bush. We went in, we expanded it. We have NATO all over Russia. We're trying to get into Georgia. We're trying to get into the Ukraine. We're trying all night and day. We have all our little assets at work. They're freaked out. And on China, we're all over the place. So this is a very dangerous world. We could take out Russia. They know it because we have an anti-ballistic missile defense now that sometimes works, we hope. But anyway, it's in Czechoslovakia. It's in all these places on the border. That's where the Pentagon gets its arrogance from. An arrogance I saw all too well in that World War II generation that commanded us in Vietnam.
Oh, my question. First, I'd like to thank you for your body of film work that you've done, Mr. Stone. I watched Born on the 4th of July, and I still remember the graphic scenes that Mr. Kovic experienced as a client of the Veterans Administration. The first person who asked the question today said that you had a one-sided body of work, but actually I would disagree. The one-sided body of work that we see every day on ABC, CBS, and NBC turns a blind eye to the homeless veterans in the United States. There are 60,000 homeless veterans, and none of our leaders gives one bit of damn about them. I'd like to see somebody put a program in place to help homeless veterans off the streets. Thank you.
Historically, I always go back to the bonus march of 1931, which was an amazing experience. The veterans of World War I were really hard luck, no money. The heart of the Depression, they marched to Washington, and they camped out in Washington, and it was quite very eloquent. General Smedley Butler, the Marine Corps, addressed them. He said, these men are not bums, because that's what most Americans were thinking. They were looking for a handout. These men are not bums. They fought in World War I, he reminded people. And ironically, General Douglas MacArthur, whose aide was Eisenhower, and Patton, whose aides ran them out with a fierce tear gas attack, and they routed them. And that was the first combat between, a few people were killed. That was the first combat between American soldiers on our ground since the Civil War. So it's an interesting story. But, the homeless veteran is always a case, but I do know that I don't know enough about it. They do put enormous amount of money into the Veterans Administration. Perhaps it can be better used, but there is big money going there, and it is a pork barrel, too. So I see, I'm a little bit, I can't answer the question. Can you?
No, I think you answered it. The answer is to not create so many more veterans who come back from these wars in such bad shape. I mean, that's what's happening with the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. Such a high percentage have PTSD. Part of the reason why the cost of the war on terror, Stiglitz and Bilms now estimate is going to be over $4 trillion, is because of the medical care that these veterans need when they come back from combat. So what we're talking about is not putting so many young Americans into combat in the first place. We're very glad that Putin intervened to prevent an American attack on Syria. Because America's reaction always, our default position, is to bomb. You look at all the countries that we've bombed since World War II, no other countries do that, or certainly not to that degree. But we always think in terms of doing that. We wrote in an article that we wish that Putin had waited one more week, because both houses of Congress would have repudiated an attack on Syria. And I think that would have sent a great message about where the United States hopes to go as opposed to where the United States has been in the past. And you even look, we showed Robert Gates up there as one of the architects of U.S. policy. Even Robert Gates said we shouldn't attack Syria.
Even Robert Gates said after what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, we'd be crazy to attack Syria also. So we're starting to learn that, but what we're talking about is a way to limit the number of veterans who come back after combat rather than keep that at such a high rate as it has been.
Is this your Decalogue? Or do you plan to, like, what I mean by that is like Kozlowski's Decalogue? Or do you plan on doing more, like, exploring the medium of television, doing more series?
No, hello? Yeah. No, this series took a lot out of us. This is 5 years, and I couldn't develop film projects during that. I did 2 films, but I couldn't develop and plan ahead. Films take a long time to develop. So I was really wrapped up in this, and I still am. I'm still doing a lot of interviews and a lot of appearances. Next week we're going to New York, and then we're going later in the month to the St. Louis convention for the National Council of Social Scientists. Is that correct?
Social Studies.
Social Studies. So, we keep trying to, because we're not getting mainstream help on this at all. We're definitely a marginal operation, but we're doing as well as we can. So television is, yes, it's a very lucrative. It's much more lucrative, I guess, if you have a success, but there's more failure than success there, too. I prefer films, personally, because I like to sit in a movie, and I like to have a defined movie, but I know people are junkies. I hope that they watch this series as a junkie and get into history, because it's a better drug than some of the stuff that you see. I want to make a film. Yes, I'd like to. That's my my main body of work. I've done 6 documentaries. This is the biggest. This is the most classical.
So
hey, I've done enough. Can I retire pretty soon or not? I can go to some veterans hospital.
This is the second to last question, and then we're going to. The books are being sold outside, and the book signing will take place in here. We'll bring the table up here. So second to last question.
First, I'd like to thank you both for your hard work on that. I was very impressed and enlightened by that. But one thing I recall is some of these agendas. I noticed the theme is sort of an irrational morality. We have to dominate the world because of these ideals. But I think there's another side also, and I remember a document from the neoconservatives called A Clean Break, and it was almost a policy looking for an Osama bin Laden as an excuse to invade Iraq. So I think some of this is pre-existing agendas looking for a boogeyman or a pretense to enact them. So that I think serves an interesting purpose to maybe look at. There's another side. There's the irrational sort of view of our world dominance, but also there are some interests that have an agenda and are looking for something to provoke.
We think that they have a conscious agenda. We trace it back sometimes to a fascinating document that George Kennan wrote in 1948. Kennan, as you know, was the architect of containment policy and early Cold War strategy for the United States. In a secret memo, he said, the United States has 6.3% of the world's population, but we own 50% of the world's wealth. How are we going to keep that disparity? He said, we're not going to do it through idealism by supporting democracy and elections and these fancy phrases. We're going to do it by hard power politics and strategic, realistic goals around the world. And that's what the United States has done. Beneath that veneer of democracy and freedom is a reality the United States has controlled the world's economy. Alan Greenspan, the former head of the Federal Reserve, said that it's too bad that people are denying what the Iraq war is all about. He says the reality, of course, is Iraq is all about oil. Our policy is driven by economic interests. The military-industrial complex is something that's self-feeding, self-perpetuating, but it's enormous. And Oliver was talking about Eisenhower's role. Most young people, when they think of Eisenhower, if they know anything, they think about his warnings against the military-industrial complex. What they don't know is that he was instrumental in creating it. When Eisenhower took office, we had 1,000 nuclear weapons. When he left office, we had 23,000. When his budgeting cycle was over, we had 30,000 nuclear weapons. I mean, this policy of threatening the world with annihilation in order to maintain American economic and political privilege in the world doesn't make sense. So that's what we're challenging here. A world in which the richest 300 have more wealth than the poorest 3 billion. A world in which the United States controls the planet with our bases, with our fleets, with our arms that we're selling everywhere, with military alliances. So there's a connection between the seemingly irrational policies on the one hand and the real underbelly, which is the economic interest that they're tied to.
This is a question, kind of looking towards the future. You know, as the episode ended, when you have these revelations, the Julian Assange's WikiLeaks, the Bradley Manning thing, the Edward Snowden revelations, and I remember when Julian Assange was like starting his whole WikiLeaks project, you know, in full force. You know, he kept talking about it as this radical history lesson, right, where you're opening up the archives of government to and diplomatic history to kind of make government transparent. So I wonder if you can say anything, or even reflecting on past U.S. history or past global history, something about the tension between transparency in government and this kind of need for gentle, careful, diplomatic manners and secrecy.
I think one thing that comes right to mind is there's a very interesting irony to this whole thing is that when the communists took over finally in Russia during the World War I, when they had been slaughtered, and Lenin and Trotsky, they released all the documents and all the secret treaties that had been made between Russia, England, France, and the great empires. Those treaties revealed devastating results, just like WikiLeaks today. How to divide the world, how they were going to keep the world, the Arabic world, how they were going to keep that, how the Asia was going to be divided. It was all agreements. What? I'm sorry. So the communists were vilified, like WikiLeaks was vilified. Woodrow Wilson, liberal president, hated Lenin and hated what he stood for because he had broken the diplomatic agreements between countries. The same way Obama's reacting to WikiLeaks and Snowden. Peter, you were going to say something? I don't know what your question was, but well, governments lie, and that's what we figured out much more. When I grew up, I believed the government. My father told me to believe them. You know, I didn't realize how corrupt this thing was. Watergate taught us a lot in the 70s. Frank Church's committee, a great committee on the CIA, revealed a world to us that we didn't know about. He started that revelation of the CIA. Even Harry Truman was calling for, had admitted in an article that he had created a monster, a Frankenstein. He said, you know, everybody was talking about abolishing the CIA. It had become a Gestapo. And in fact, it has, but so has the whole country. The military-industrial complex is we have 1 million people in top secret, with a top secret clearance, more than 1 million. So we have a universe here. Many of you in the room could be one of these people. You know, they're all over. The same informers that were in the 1950s. Don't forget, J. Edgar Hoover had 500,000 people on his list of people who were against the Vietnam War, or were for civil rights. They were people for change, for reform, labor union people, always against reform in the United States, always agitators. We're worried about them, and Hoover used to blame it on Moscow or Beijing. It's amazing what was believed at any point in time. I think we live in fear, we live in isolation, we live in paranoia, and this is what we see constantly through our history. Why would it suddenly go away? Maybe it did in the 1970s. They passed that act that allowed the FISA courts, right? That was supposed to be the great cure. Okay, we can have intelligence, we can have security, but we'll have a FISA court watching. And what has happened? The FISA courts have been completely corrupted, appointed by Supreme Courts, most of them conservative now. John Roberts determines who's going to be on FISA, and FISA can't be trusted. No one can. Everyone knows we can't trust Obama when he says we're going to fix this, we're going to reform ourselves. We never do. So go ahead.
But we have heroes out there. I mean, Chelsea Manning, Assange, Wyden, Udall. I mean, there are people. Russ Feingold had the guts to vote against the Patriot Act. Barbara Lee, Snowden. Snowden.
Lady.
I mean, there are people out there with courage. Dan Ellsberg is one of our close friends. We do events the three of us speak at together. They can't control this. And they're trying to control it. The amount of information that came out that's been released has exposed so much, and it's triggered a lot of the uprisings around the world. It's had a very positive effect. One of the points we make here is that if you commit war crimes, then you walk the streets free. If you expose them, if you tell the truth, you can spend the rest of your life in jail or in some embassy in London. You know, that's a reality, and it's a frightening reality. You think of what a great movie like The Lies of Others, what that showed about East German society. The goal of the Stasi was to know everything about everybody. They were amateurs. They were bunglers. They were inept. But we have perfected that ability. We have a government now that can know everything about everybody. So with the new technological advances and the worldview that these people have, they're trying to achieve that. And globally. And now people in France and Germany and other countries, Brazil, are furious about what we're doing over there as well as here. So for us, the problem is not to get the American people concerned or aware right now. It's to get them to act and do something. Right? To begin, one of our goals in challenging this perception of history was the assumption that people are guided by a view of history. And how people act in the world is shaped by their view of history. If people think that the way things turned out is the only way they could have turned out, they're not going to have any ability to envision a different future. And if they don't have a ability to envision a different future, they're not going to act to make real changes. But what we're saying is that history could have been different. As Oliver says, the curve of the ball could have broken differently. He's a catcher, I was a pitcher. We know what that means. But history came so many times. One of the things we show and emphasize how close over and over again we had to creating a different kind of reality in the United States and around the world. So we don't want people to despair over the power that these people have over us. What we want people to do is understand it could have been different, that they have power, we have power too. And as we've seen around the world, you never know when that's going to happen. Oliver might want to talk about when you were in Russia.
Yeah, I was just one last closing story, if you don't mind. I don't want to think, I'm not going to, it's clear that we were able to make this documentary series, and through a miracle we got it on cable television. So we are allowed freedom of expression. This is clear. And I'm not going to compare the United States to the Soviet Union, because you couldn't do that back then. And you can't, and you have a hard time today, and in China too. I'm not going to compare them that way, but I am going to say that we run the same risk of oppression, because I could make the series. I am well known enough. I guess we got it financed, we got it on the air, but most people could not get this close to television. It takes a push. You need to have some inside mojo, and I was barely able. We did still. You cannot get on television in America unless you're basically some dumb news show or dumb reality TV show, because that's the way you get sponsored. You don't want controversy. Anybody's going to put money in our corporate society into public exhibition, they're not going to take risk. They're not going to take any kind of risk to their money. And that's a shame, but that's the way it works in our society. It's a choke-off. So there is a form of economic censorship. However, with these new rules and what they know now and the eavesdropping, things could change. Obama is a reasonable man, no question. He's a good manager of empire. But what about if we get another George Bush? What if we have another terror attack and it's a devastatingly horrible one? What happens then to this country? The Hoovers, the hardliners, the Curtis LeMays, they come out all the time. They're there. They're amongst us. People are hardliners. Maybe you know some yourself. I do, quite a few. And they are the ones who, the moment there's an attack, fear, they kick in, and that old thing, that clutch, that strangulation starts. In the Soviet Union, I was there in early 1980s to do a script on dissidents in the Soviet Union. I followed 10, 12 cities. Many of them had been put in psychiatric hospitals, very damaged people, but they remembered. They had a vivid, vivid memory of of what they were fighting for. Sakharov was their leader. But what I saw was a society in decay. It was in 1983. There was no incentive anywhere. There was no incentive to work, and there was no compassion. There was no love. There was nothing between people. The society was as dead as I've ever seen one. It was depressing to be there for 25 days. I kissed the earth when I got to Paris. Kissed the earth just to be free and to have a good meal. But that system was over. It was over. And although they'll tell you Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War, that's bullshit. The guy who ended the Cold War was Mikhail Gorbachev. And who was he? He was a product of that system, which shows you that inside a system, sometimes there grows a tree, a root, hope. Gorbachev came up from the bottom, and he was an agricultural expert. And in agriculture, like Henry Wallace in the United States, he saw all the problems endemic to communism. It didn't work. People were lying, funneling profits, etc. He knew that system was over. And when he got up, by chance, by luck, he got good mentors. Andropov got him in finally. When he got his chance to run the place, he appealed to the reason of those people who could see the decay of their economy. And he said, let's reform this economy before it's too late. Part of that reform, not all of it, was to give an olive branch, to cut back on their military. And he did so, and he offered Reagan a sweetheart of a deal. He pulled all the troops out of Eastern Europe. He offered to abolish nuclear weapons if Reagan would abolish Star Wars, which he would not do. But essentially, he put everything on the table. And I was in my 30s. I was shocked. The whole world had a beautiful springtime of a few years when the Soviet Union just went away. And communism crumbled in every single country, including East Germany. The wall came down. Kennedy had almost fought a war for that wall in 1962. Kennedy has said a wall is better than a war, thank God, because if he had fought a war, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But anyway, Gorbachev, 20 years later, got that wall down, not Reagan. And they let it, and they didn't fight back. And yet, how did we respond to that? Well, that's another story. It's in the book, in chapter 9. But anyway, I just want to make that point that I think our society is where the Soviet Union was then. I think we are moribund. I think there's something wrong. We're corrupt. The economy is corrupt. There's too many large corporations, too many wealthy individuals. It's like the Soviet Union, a two-tier system. And the people at the bottom, nobody gives a fuck about them. And that's what's going to bring us down. And I think, who knows what? The curve of the ball can break differently. Maybe it'll be some morons from the Republican Party who will stop government. Maybe we should stop the government. Maybe we won't pay the military. Maybe something will shrink. Who knows where it comes from? Who knows? Maybe it'll be a climate change or a storm or something. You never know. We were in 1989, 91. We never expected that to happen. So keep an open mind.